The moment Benjamin Watkins saw Stella Collins push the last biscuit across the table toward the youngest child and quietly pretend she had already eaten, something cracked open in his chest that he was not entirely sure he knew how to close again. It was the autumn of 1873, and the town of Harrow Creek, Texas, sat baking under a sun that had forgotten how to be merciful. The land stretched out in all directions like a tired old man who had given up trying to be beautiful, red dust rising in spirals whenever the wind remembered itself. The scrub brush gray and bone dry along every trail. Harrow Creek was not a wealthy town. It was not even a comfortable town. It was the kind of place people ended up when they had been heading somewhere else and run out of either money or hope before they got there. Benjamin had arrived in Harrow Creek 6 months prior, hired on as a ranch hand by old Thomas Greer, whose cattle operation was modest but honest. Benjamin was 28 years old, broad through the shoulders, with dark hair that always looked like the wind had been at it regardless of how recently he had combed it, and eyes the color of the sky just before a storm rolls in. That particular deep gray blue that made people unsure whether they were looking at something calm or something dangerous. He was neither particularly one nor the other. He was simply a man who paid attention, and in a world full of men who preferred not to, that made him unusual. Stella Collins ran the boarding house at the edge of Main Street. She had taken it over from her mother 2 years prior, when fever had swept through Harrow Creek and taken 3 souls in a single terrible week, her mother among them. Stella was 24 years old and had been managing everything ever since, with the kind of quiet ferocity that people mistake for simplicity until they pay close enough attention. She had warm brown eyes and dark auburn hair that she kept pinned up during the working hours, though by evening it always found ways to escape in soft curls around her face. She had her mother's hands, capable and rough at the knuckles from work, and her father's stubbornness, which was the only inheritance he had left before he disappeared westward when Stella was 9 years old, chasing gold or silver or something else that glittered more than a family did. The boarding house served meals twice daily. Breakfast at 6 in the morning and supper at 6 in the evening, and every soul who paid their weekly rate got a seat at the long pine table in the dining room. Currently Stella kept 6 boarders. There was old Cyrus Holt, a former telegraph operator whose hands shook too badly now to key a message, but who could still tell you the price of cattle in Kansas City on any given day of any given year going back 15 years. There was a young schoolteacher named Margaret Poe who had come from Georgia and cried quietly on her first night, and had been stoic as iron ever since. There was a pair of brothers, Dale and Frank Whitmore, who worked at the mill and always came to supper smelling of sawdust and pine sap. There was a traveling medicine man named Harold Voss, who stayed far longer than traveling men usually did, which Stella suspected meant his road had gotten complicated in ways he had not yet explained. And there was Benjamin Watkins, who had taken the corner room upstairs 3 months ago when the bunkhouse at the Greer Ranch had flooded in a freak September rain, and Thomas Greer had told his hands to find alternate arrangements until the repairs were done, and who had simply never left, because the food was good, and the room was quiet, and there was something about the woman who ran the place that made a man want to stay close to whatever warmth she created. Stella was careful with the food. She kept a kitchen garden out back, the soil watered by hand every morning before the boarders were awake, growing what she could in the difficult Texas earth. She bought what she could not grow at Crawford's General Store, and she kept meticulous accounts in a small leather-bound ledger that she filled in every night by lamplight at the kitchen table. Benjamin had seen her at it once or twice when he came down late for a glass of water, bent over the ledger with her reading spectacles on and her hair down, her lips moving slightly as she did the arithmetic, and the sight had done something to him that arithmetic had never done for anyone else in recorded history. The trouble was that the autumn of 1873 was difficult across all of Texas. A national financial panic had begun in September of that year, the kind that starts in the big eastern cities and ripples outward until it reaches even the smallest and most remote places. And Harrow Creek felt it in the way all small places feel such things, slowly at first, then all at once. The mill cut its workers' hours. Thomas Greer sold off a portion of his herd rather than winter-feed animals he wasn't sure would fetch a good price in the spring. Crawford raised his prices on flour, sugar, and salt pork because his own suppliers had raised theirs. Stella's boarders were struggling. Dale and Frank Whitmore had their hours cut at the mill and came to her one Sunday evening with their hats in their hands and asked if she could give them a few more weeks on their weekly rate. That they were good for it. They swore it. They just needed a little more time. And Stella, who had gone over her ledger 3 nights running and knew exactly what she could and could not afford, had looked at those 2 earnest, sunburned men and told them, of course, not to worry, pay her when they could. Old Cyrus had a small pension from his telegraph days, but it was not generous, and Margaret Poe's school salary had been reduced by the town council, who were cutting expenses wherever they could find them. Harold Voss sold his tonics and remedies at a price most people could no longer pay. Stella began to manage the shortfalls the way women in difficult circumstances have always managed them, quietly, invisibly, and at her own expense. She stretched the stew further, added more broth and fewer potatoes, but arranged everything in the pot so that each bowl still looked full. She baked the biscuits a touch smaller but put 3 on each person's plate, so the number seemed generous. She ate less. Not nothing, never nothing, because she was not foolish about her own health, but less. A biscuit instead of 2, half a bowl when she served herself. The last serving from the pot, which was always the thinnest, going into her own bowl while she gave everyone else the heartier ladlefuls from the middle. She never mentioned it. She never made a face about it. She simply moved through her own dining room serving everyone else with a warm smile and genuine pleasure in their company, and then sat at the end of the table with her modest portion, and listened to the conversation and laughed when there was something to laugh at, which she always found even on the hardest evenings, because that was another thing she had inherited from her mother, the ability to find the bright edge of a dark thing. Benjamin noticed on a Tuesday. He had been watching her for weeks, though not in a manner he had fully acknowledged to himself. He simply found his eyes drifting to her the way they might drift to a fire on a cold night, not thinking about it, just orienting toward warmth. He had noticed the way she refilled everyone else's coffee before her own. He had noticed the way she always made sure old Cyrus had enough salt for his food, because the old man liked everything well seasoned. He had noticed the small personal attention she gave each boarder, the way she remembered that Margaret Poe liked her eggs soft, and that Frank Whitmore couldn't abide onions, and that Harold Voss took his coffee with 2 sugars. But on that Tuesday evening in October, Benjamin was seated 3 chairs down from the head of the table where Stella always sat, and something shifted in his angle of attention. He watched her ladle stew into each bowl with genuine generosity, the serving spoon going deep into the pot each time, and then he watched her take what was left. He watched her sit down and look at her bowl and take a breath so small and so quickly controlled that if he had been looking anywhere else he would have missed it entirely. He watched her smile at something Cyrus said about the telegraph, and he watched her eat slowly, in the careful way of a person making a small portion last as long as a large one. He looked at his own bowl. It was full and hot and smelled of the herbs she grew out back, rosemary and sage, and something else he could never name. He looked back at her bowl. He sat with that knowledge all through supper, and all through the clearing of the table, and all through the evening, when most of the boarders retired early because coal oil for the lamps was expensive and sleep was free. He sat on the porch in the cool October dark with his hat in his hands, and turned it over and over like a wheel that wasn't going anywhere. And he thought about Stella Collins eating half of what she ought to eat so that a telegraph man with shaking hands, and a homesick schoolteacher from Georgia, and 2 mill workers, and a traveling medicine man, and one distracted cowboy could all have enough. He was back in the dining room at 5 o'clock the next morning, an hour before breakfast, because he had worked out in the night what he intended to do, and he wanted to do it before she had built up the walls of her day and would be harder to approach. She was already in the kitchen, of course. She was always already in the kitchen. She turned from the stove when she heard him on the stairs, spatula raised in mild surprise, her hair pinned but not yet entirely disciplined, a loose curl falling along her cheek. "Mr. Watkins," she said, "you are up very early." "I couldn't sleep," he said, which was true, though he did not tell her why. He settled himself at the kitchen work table, which was not a thing boarders normally did, and she looked at him with an expression that was partly amused and partly watchful. "Can I ask you something, Miss Collins?" "I suppose that depends on what it is," she said, turning back to the stove with the careful ease of a woman who did not stop working just because someone was talking to her. "How long has it been since you've had a full supper?" he asked. The kitchen went very quiet except for the pop and hiss of the fire and the small sound of her inhaling. She did not answer immediately. She set the spatula down on the edge of the stove with a neat, precise movement, and then she turned and looked at him, and her eyes were very steady, the way eyes are when a person has decided they are not going to be rattled. "I eat every evening at my own table, Mr. Watkins," she said. "I know you do," he said. "And I know you eat what's left in the pot after everyone else is served, because what's left at the bottom is always thinner. And I know that last Tuesday you had maybe half a bowl, because I watched." Something moved across her face that was not quite embarrassment and not quite anger. It was more like the look a person gets when they are caught being generous and find it somehow more uncomfortable than being caught at something shameful. "The stew was adequate," she said. "It was not," he said, pleasantly but without any give in him at all. "Miss Collins, you are running yourself thin to make sure everyone else at that table is comfortable, and I am not willing to sit at your table and eat a full bowl of stew knowing that the woman who cooked it is going hungry." "I am not going hungry," she said, and there was a spark of genuine irritation in it now. "I am managing a difficult season carefully, as anyone sensible would do." "You are managing everyone else's difficult season," he said, "not your own." She stared at him. He held her gaze with the steady patience of a man who has worked with horses and knows that you do not look away. "What exactly is it you want to say, Mr. Watkins?" she asked at last. "I want to say that starting today I am going to help with the provisions," he said. "I have a wage from the Greer Ranch that I am not spending on much of anything. I would like to put some of it toward the household expenses, specifically the food, and I would like to do it in such a way that you let me." She crossed her arms. "That is not what you pay your weekly rate for." "My weekly rate covers the room," he said. "The rest is my own business to spend how I like, and I like to spend it on this." "Why?" she asked. The word came out plainly, without decoration, because Stella Collins was a plain-spoken woman when she was surprised into it. He looked at her for a moment, and the honest answer pushed against the back of his teeth, but he was not ready to say the honest answer yet, because the honest answer was that there was not a thing in this world he was less willing to bear than the sight of her going without, and that was a feeling he needed to understand better before he put it into words. "Because it is the right thing to do," he said instead. She studied him for a long moment with those steady brown eyes, and he had the unsettling feeling that she had heard the thing he had not said as clearly as the thing he had. $2 a month extra," she said finally. "That is all I will take." "5," he said. "3," she said, and her chin came up. "Done," he said, and he put out his hand. She looked at it, and then she shook it once firmly, the grip of a woman who had been shaking hands on practical matters since she was old enough to be taken seriously in them. He went to Crawford's General Store that same morning before his shift at the Greer Ranch, and spent considerably more than $3, because he purchased what he bought in his own name and kept it separate from what he gave Stella. And he arranged with Eli Crawford to have certain goods delivered to the boarding house on a weekly basis, billed to Benjamin Watkins. And he told Eli that if Miss Collins came in and asked about it to tell her, it was a standing arrangement for the household and leave the details vague. And Eli, who was a sensible man and could see that whatever was happening here was none of his business to complicate, agreed. The change in the kitchen was noticeable within a week. The stew had more substance to it, the biscuits returned to their proper size, and there was occasionally a dish that had not appeared on the table in some time, a roasted chicken one Sunday, a proper apple pie on a Thursday when the dried apples arrived from Crawford's. The boarders noticed and were grateful and asked no questions, because people in difficult seasons have learned not to question good things too closely in case the questioning makes them go away. Stella noticed, and she asked no questions either, though she knew. She served every meal with the same warm attention she always had, and she served herself a full bowl, and Benjamin watched her do it from his seat 3 chairs down with a feeling in his chest that was not simple, and was not going to become simpler any time soon. She caught him watching on a Friday evening in November, and instead of looking away, she met his eyes steadily across the table, and something passed between them that was not a word and was not nothing. And old Cyrus, who was 81 years old and had been watching people fall in love since before the Civil War had made everyone so grim about everything, smiled into his coffee. The weeks that followed had a particular quality to them that Benjamin had never encountered in his life before, which had been a fairly uncomplicated life of cattle and open country, and the kind of freedom that looks good from the outside and gets lonely faster than most men will admit. He began to find reasons to be at the boarding house in the early morning and the evenings, not just sleeping there, but present in a way that boarders typically were not. He repaired the porch railing that had been wobbling since summer. He chopped and stacked firewood against the side of the house until there was enough to see them through the worst of winter without worry. He fixed the latch on the back gate that led to the kitchen garden, and that Stella had been meaning to fix for 3 months. He did these things without announcement or ceremony, and Stella received them without ceremony, thanking him with the practical directness she brought to everything, as though good deeds were simply good deeds and did not require a great deal of elaborate acknowledgement to be genuine. But she began to linger in the kitchen on the evenings when she found him still on the premises, coming in with some excuse about something that needed doing, and they would talk, first about the practical business of the boarding house and the town and the weather, and then gradually about other things. He told her about growing up in Missouri, about a father who had worked a river ferry and a mother who had grown roses with the same determination other women put into raising children, both activities requiring, as his mother said, a great deal of patience and a willingness to accept that living things have their own ideas about what direction they want to grow in. He told her about coming west at 22, about the years of ranch work across 3 states, about the way the open country had suited him when he was younger and seemed to ask something different of him now, seemed to press against him with a question he had not yet found the language for. Stella told him about her mother, about the boarding house, about the 9-year-old girl who had watched her father ride away and had understood even at that age that he was not the sort of man who came back. She told him about the 2 years since her mother died, about the responsibility of it and the loneliness of it, and the strange, complicated pride of having kept the thing alive. She told him that she had wanted once to study, that she had borrowed every book she could find and read voraciously, and had dreamed about what that kind of education might feel like, and that she had made her peace with the fact that it was not going to happen mostly, except on nights when the ledger balanced badly and the kitchen garden looked depleted, and she was very tired, and then sometimes she let herself wonder a little before she put it away. He listened to all of it with the same quality of attention that distinguished him, the kind that made a person feel that what they were saying was worth the air it was traveling through. One evening in late November, when the first real cold had come down from the north, and the wind was finding every gap in the boarding house walls with cheerful thoroughness, Stella was at the kitchen table with her ledger and Benjamin came down for the glass of water that had become an understood fiction between them, an excuse for both of them to be in the same room at the same hour without having to name what they were actually doing there. She was wearing a shawl over her work dress and her hair was down, the lamplight making it all warm amber and copper, and she looked up at him over her spectacles with an expression that was habitual and easy, the way you look at someone who has become part of the landscape of your daily life. "The ledger is better," she said, by way of greeting. "Good," he said. He poured his water and sat across from her at the table without being asked, which he had stopped asking permission to do some weeks prior. "You know I know it's you," she said, setting her pen down. "The arrangement at Crawford's." "I know you know," he said. "I told you $3, she said. "You told me $3 for what you take directly," he said. "I make my own arrangements where I want to." She looked at him for a long moment, and there was something in her eyes that was warmer than irritation and more complicated than gratitude. "Benjamin," she said, and it was the first time she had used his given name without the formality of the Mr. before it, and the sound of it from her mouth landed somewhere in him like a struck match. "Stella," he said. And then neither of them said anything for a while, because the silence had a texture to it that words would have only gotten in the way of. "Why are you doing this?" she asked at last. "And please don't tell me it's the right thing to do. You said that once and I let you have it, but I am asking you now for the honest answer." He turned the water glass in his hands, looking at it, and then he looked up at her. "Because I cannot stand the idea of you going without," he said. "Not when I can do something about it, and not only because you deserve better than that, though you do, but because somewhere in the past few months you have become the most important person in my world. And I don't know exactly how to say that without it coming out all wrong and frightening you off. So I have been saying it in firewood and flour and repaired latches instead." The lamp flickered in a draft from somewhere, and the kitchen was very warm and very quiet. Stella took off her spectacles with slow care and set them on the ledger, and she looked at him with eyes that were very bright in the lamplight. "You didn't frighten me," she said. "No," he said. "No," she said, "though you probably should have. I am not accustomed to people paying attention to me the way you pay attention to me, and it took me some time to know what to do with it." "What did you decide?" he asked, and his voice was very quiet. "I decided," she said, "that I don't want you to stop." He let out a breath that he had been holding for somewhere in the vicinity of 3 months. "I don't intend to," he said. They sat there in the warm kitchen while the November wind did its thorough work on the walls of the boarding house, and Stella made 2 cups of coffee because the night had gotten cold enough to warrant it, and they talked until well past midnight. And when he finally went up to his corner room, he lay in the dark and felt something settle in him like the final piece of something very large and complicated clicking into exactly the place it was always meant to occupy. The courtship, if it could be called that, had a quality of inevitability to it that surprised neither of them once they stopped pretending it wasn't happening. It was conducted with the practical romance of 2 people whose lives were too full of real work to have room for anything frivolous, which meant it happened in the margins of days already occupied by cattle and kitchens and ledgers, and the general business of keeping a life functional in 1870s Texas. He began taking her walking on Sunday afternoons, which was the one afternoon of the week when the boarding house was settled, and the Greer ranch could manage without him for a few hours. They walked the edge of town and into the scrub country beyond it, where the light in late autumn had a particular quality that Benjamin tried once to describe and gave up on because he didn't have the vocabulary for it, and Stella, who did, described it for him instead, and he thought that was just about the finest thing that had ever happened to him, hearing her find words for things he had only ever felt. He bought her a book at Christmas. He had asked Eli Crawford to order it special, had written off to a bookseller in San Antonio in November, and it arrived just in time, a collection of essays by a woman philosopher that Stella had mentioned once in passing as something she'd heard of and always wanted to read. She opened it on Christmas morning with the other boarders around the tree that Margaret Poe had insisted on decorating despite Cyrus's complaints that pine needles got into everything. And when she saw what it was, she was quiet for a moment with her hand flat on the cover. And then she looked up at him with an expression that he decided on the spot was his favorite expression in the world, that particular mixture of being moved and trying not to show it too thoroughly. "Benjamin Watkins," she said. "Stella Collins," he said. Margaret Poe made a small sound that she converted into a cough with admirable efficiency. Old Cyrus did not bother converting anything and simply smiled with satisfaction. The new year of 1874 came in with a cold front that lasted 3 weeks and kept everyone closer to home than they might have liked, which was not entirely a hardship from Benjamin's perspective, because it kept him in Stella's kitchen more evenings than usual, and he was not a man who suffered from too much time in her company. It was in January that he had his first real conversation with her about the future, not the abstract future but the specific one, the one that pertained to both of them and what shape it might take. They had been sitting in the parlor after supper, the other boarders gone to their rooms, the fire burning low and comfortable, and Stella had been reading her philosophy book and Benjamin had been reading nothing at all, which was something he did contentedly now in the same room with her, just being present, the way you can be with a person when their company is its own form of rest. She had looked up from her book and said, without preamble, "Do you intend to stay in Harrow Creek?" He had looked at her steadily. "That depends on whether there is something here worth staying for." "There might be," she said. "Then I intend to stay," he said. She looked at him for a long time, in that way she had that was not shy but was private, the way she held things close before she shared them. "The boarding house was never the life I chose," she said. "It chose me when my mother died, and I have made my peace with it genuinely. I want you to understand that. I love the work in ways I couldn't have predicted, but I am saying this because I want you to know that if you stayed, it would not be for a life without difficulty or limitation. It would be for this, the boarding house, Harrow Creek, the ledger that doesn't always balance." "Stella," he said, "I am serious, Benjamin. I am not a woman who has romantic fancies about men who will sweep everything into something easier and more comfortable. I am a practical person, and I would like to have a practical conversation." "All right," he said. "Practically. I have saved a modest amount of money over 6 years of ranch work. It is enough to buy a small piece of land in this county, if the right piece came available. I have been talking to Thomas Greer about the possibility of some kind of partnership arrangement on the cattle side. The boarding house is a good business that needs some investment in the roof and the east side wall, both of which I could address in the spring. Practically speaking, I think we could build something here that is more than either of us has separately. That is what I am proposing if you want the practical version." She was quiet for a moment. "And the other version?" she asked. "The other version," he said, leaning forward in his chair, "is that I am in love with you, Stella Collins, and I have been since somewhere around the second Tuesday of October when I watched you give away your supper and smile like it cost you nothing, and I would like very much to spend the rest of my life making sure you never have to do that again." The fire settled in the grate with a soft collapse of embers. Stella set her book down on the side table with careful deliberateness. "That is the version I prefer," she said. He crossed the space between them in 2 strides and she stood up to meet him, which was very like her, that she would always stand up to meet a thing rather than wait for it to arrive. And when he took her face in his hands it was with the same quality of attention he brought to everything, careful and certain and thoroughly present. He kissed her once briefly because the moment called for something that knew its own weight. "Will you marry me?" he said against her hair. "Yes," she said against his shoulder. "Practically and the other way too." He laughed then, a genuine full laugh that he had not let out in so long it surprised him with the ease of it, and she laughed with him, and outside the January wind made its disagreeable comments about the temperature, and inside the parlor of the Harrow Creek boarding house everything was warm. The engagement became known to the other boarders the next morning at breakfast in the way that things in small enclosed households become known, which is to say that Margaret Poe noticed the difference in the way they occupied the same room, and said so with the directness of a schoolteacher who did not believe in leaving subtext on the floor, and Stella confirmed it with a composure that was only slightly betrayed by the color in her face. And old Cyrus said he had known it since October and would someone please pass the butter. And Dale and Frank Whitmore shook Benjamin's hand with the earnest enthusiasm of men who had never been entirely comfortable with the amount of tension in the dining room and were relieved to see it resolved into something everyone could understand. Harold Voss, who had a sentimental streak under his salesman's exterior, produced a small bottle of good whiskey from his room that he had apparently been saving for an occasion, and even though it was 7 in the morning, everyone had a small glass with their coffee, and Margaret Poe did not mention that it was 7 in the morning, which was the most gracious thing anyone could have done. Benjamin rode out to the Greer ranch that morning and told Thomas Greer that he was getting married and intended to stay in Harrow Creek permanently. And Thomas Greer, who was 70 years old and had been watching young men waste their lives on roaming when they had perfectly good reasons to stay put, said it was about time, and what did Benjamin know about a partnership arrangement? Because his own sons had gone east and shown no interest in cattle, and he had been wondering what was going to happen to the operation when he got too old to run it himself. The conversation that followed lasted 4 hours and involved a great deal of coffee and 2 pieces of paper that Thomas Greer produced from a desk drawer that was clearly used to holding important documents under a pile of less important ones. And by the time Benjamin rode back into Harrow Creek in the late afternoon, he had the outlines of an arrangement that would give him a stake in the Greer cattle operation and a share of the profits in exchange for taking on more of the management, with the understanding that over time and with continued good faith, the arrangement would formalize into something more permanent. He came back to the boarding house with the energy of a man who has spent a day setting the foundations of something real, and Stella, who was in the kitchen garden harvesting the last of the winter sage when he came through the back gate, looked up at the expression on his face and said, "It went well." "Better than well," he said, and he told her about it with the enthusiasm of a man who had never quite had something of his own to be enthusiastic about and found the sensation considerable. She listened with her full attention, and when he had finished she said, "You are going to be very good at this," in a tone that was not flattery but simple observation, the way she assessed things, and it meant more to him than praise from anyone else would have. They were married in March of 1874, on a Saturday when the Texas sky had decided to be blue in the way it could be in early spring, a blue so total and uncompromising that it seemed to be making a statement about the nature of things. The ceremony was performed by the Methodist minister in the small white church on the south end of Main Street, with every boarder from the boarding house present, and Thomas Greer in the front pew looking pleased in the way old men look when they have been right about something for a long time. Eli Crawford and his wife came, and several of the other townspeople who had gotten fond of Stella over the years of her running the boarding house, and feeding them on the occasions when their own circumstances had been difficult. Margaret Poe had made Stella a bouquet of dried flowers and winter greenery tied with ribbon she had been saving since Georgia, which she presented with a formality that was really just deeply felt feeling in schoolteacher's clothing, and Stella had hugged her with genuine warmth and told her she was the finest friend she had in Harrow Creek, which was true, and which made Margaret Poe step back and press her handkerchief to her eyes with dignity. Benjamin stood at the front of that little church and watched Stella walk toward him on Cyrus Holt's arm, because the old man had offered and Stella had accepted, and she was wearing a dress that was not new but had been carefully mended and pressed, and wore her very well, and her hair was down in the way he loved it, held back from her face with 2 small combs that had been her mother's, and she was looking at him with those steady, warm brown eyes that had been looking at him in his thoughts for months. and he felt something so large and so certain move through him that he was not entirely sure he was still a man who could be described as composed. He was, but only just. The vows were traditional, because the minister in Harrow Creek was a traditional man, and neither Stella nor Benjamin objected to the traditional words, because the traditional words said exactly what they meant without a great deal of ornamentation, and both of them were people who respected words that did their job cleanly. When the minister said he could kiss his bride, Benjamin did it with the same quality of care and certainty that he brought to all things, his hands on her face, and Stella's hands came up and covered his, and the church was very quiet and then very loud, because old Cyrus whooped with the enthusiasm of a man who had earned the right to express himself, and the Whitmore brothers applauded with their large millworker hands, and even Margaret Poe, who was a Georgia schoolteacher and had standards about decorum, said something very enthusiastic that she would not later be able to repeat in a classroom. The celebration that followed was held at the boarding house, because where else would it be held, and Stella had cooked for 2 days in preparation, and the table was more full than it had ever been, and everyone ate until they could not eat more, and this time Benjamin watched Stella serve herself first and fully, and with the ease of a woman who no longer had any reason to give her portion away. Because everything at this table was provided for, and she was part of the providing and not the sacrifice that made it possible. He was watching her, and she caught him watching, and she raised her glass of lemonade at him across the table with a look in her eyes that was private and warm and entirely his, and he raised his glass back. And old Cyrus said he was going to start a telegraph just to report this back east, because the Northeast needed the news that something good was happening somewhere. The first year of their marriage was the kind of year that builds a life properly, which means it involved a great deal of work and a great deal of learning and a great deal of the particular joy that comes from building something real with a person you love. Benjamin took on more and more of the day-to-day management of the Greer operation, rising before dawn to oversee the cattle and the hands, working the land with a sense of investment that was different in quality from anything he had brought to ranch work before, because before it had been another man's concern, and now it was pointed towards something he was building for himself and for Stella. He came home to the boarding house in the evenings with the smell of cattle and open land on him, and Stella had learned the rhythm of when he would arrive, and had supper ready with a timing that was its own form of attention. The boarding house continued to run, because it was still needed, and they still needed the income while the cattle partnership found its footing. But they made changes. Benjamin's income allowed them to be more generous with the kitchen, and the table at the boarding house became quietly known around Harrow Creek as a place where the portions were honest, and the cooking was better than anything else in town, and 2 new boarders took the rooms that the Whitmore brothers vacated when they found work in a larger town to the west, and then another new boarder after that, and the ledger improved steadily. Margaret Poe stayed. She stayed because her school had grown, and because Harrow Creek had become home in the way places do when you let them, slowly and then irrevocably. She and Stella had developed the kind of friendship that women of intelligence and practicality develop when they share a household long enough, the kind where you can say exactly what you think and know the other person will take the measure of it fairly. Margaret had begun to be fond of a young man named Robert Alcott who worked at the land office, and she discussed him with Stella in the kitchen, with a frankness that would have alarmed Robert Alcott considerably if he had known about it. And Stella gave her opinions honestly and well, because Stella was constitutionally incapable of telling people what they wanted to hear when the truth was more useful. Old Cyrus's health declined as the year wore on, which was a grief that moved through the household quietly, and with the acceptance that comes from love without illusion. He was 81 years old and had lived more of a life than most men manage, and he faced the fact of his own fading with a dignity that Stella found both admirable and heartbreaking. She sat with him often in the evenings, and Benjamin would join them when the day's work was done. And the three of them would talk, and Cyrus told stories about the telegraph days and the war and the things he had seen that were so far removed from the world of 1874 Texas that they seemed almost to belong to another species of time entirely. Cyrus Holt died in December of 1874, peacefully, in his room at the boarding house, with Stella holding one of his shaking old hands, and Benjamin standing in the doorway because the old man had insisted he didn't need a fuss made, which Benjamin honored, though he stayed where he could be seen because he thought the old man probably wanted to know someone was there, even if he didn't want to admit it. They buried him in the Harrow Creek Cemetery on a cold, clear day, and Stella put flowers on the grave that she had dried herself from the kitchen garden, and Benjamin stood beside her with his hand at the small of her back, and she leaned into him just slightly, and they stood there long after the other mourners had moved away. In the spring of 1875, Stella told Benjamin she was with child. She told him in the kitchen, early in the morning, because morning was their best time, the time before the boarding house woke up and the ranch needed tending, the hour that belonged entirely to them. She had been certain for 3 weeks but had been sorting through how she felt about it before she said anything to anyone, because that was how she approached large things. She needed to understand her own response before she shared it. She told him plainly, watching his face with the careful attention of a woman who wanted to know the honest reaction, not the performed one. His face did something complicated, and then opened out into an expression she had never seen on it before, and she recognized it after a moment as an unguarded joy, the kind that doesn't know what to do with itself and goes very still for a second before it knows what direction to go. He crossed the kitchen and put his arms around her with a gentleness that was different from his usual gentleness, which was already considerable, and she pressed her forehead to his shoulder and let out a breath that she had apparently been holding since she first understood what was happening. "Are you well?" he said into her hair. "How are you feeling?" "Terribly in the mornings," she said. "Better by afternoon. I expect that is normal." "We should have the doctor come," he said. "Dr. Hartley is already aware," she said. "I have been managing this for 3 weeks, Benjamin. I am not entirely helpless." "I know you are not," he said. "I know that completely. I just want to be allowed to fuss a little." "You can fuss a very moderate amount," she said. "That is all I ask," he said. He fussed considerably more than a moderate amount, but he did it in the ways she could accept, which were the practical ways, making sure she rested when she could, and that the kitchen work was shared more evenly, and that there was always food she could eat even in the difficult mornings when most food was uninviting. He hired a local woman named Dora Finch to come in 3 mornings a week to help in the kitchen, and Stella accepted this with more grace than he expected, which told him that she had been more tired than she had been letting on. The pregnancy was not easy. The summer of 1875 was brutally hot even by Texas standards, and Stella was large with child through the worst of it, and the boarding house did not slow down for anyone's condition. But she managed, as she managed everything, with a stubbornness that he had long since stopped trying to argue with and had simply learned to work alongside. He was there in the evenings always, sitting with her on the porch in the slight cooling that came after sunset, her hand in his, talking about everything and nothing, the cattle and the boarding house and the names they had discussed, and the room they had cleared and readied, going over the small domestic plans that were really just the two of them building their future one conversation at a time. Their son was born in October of 1875 in the corner room upstairs that had once been Benjamin's, because Stella had made the room into a nursery and it had the best light. Dr. Hartley presided with brisk competence, and Benjamin was downstairs because the doctor held traditional views about where fathers ought to be, and Benjamin held his own views about everything. But Stella had told him to stay down there and not worry, and he trusted her enough to do As she said, though, he spent 3 hours in a state of near-total incapacity sitting at the kitchen table with his hands around a cold cup of coffee. When Dr. Hartley came down and told him he had a son, and that Stella was well, Benjamin went upstairs with a speed that was not entirely consistent with the dignified composure he generally maintained, and Stella was in the bed with their son in the crook of her arm, and she looked at him with the expression of a woman who has done something extraordinary and knows it. And he sat on the edge of the bed and looked at the small, crumpled face of his boy with an awe that was so large it had gone completely quiet inside him. "He looks like trouble," he said. "He looks exactly like you," she said. "That is what I said," he said. She laughed, which the baby seemed to find objectionable, because he made a small, indignant sound, and they both fell immediately and completely silent, and looked at him with the total absorption of new parents everywhere and at every time, as though the infant had done something unprecedented rather than simply existing. They named him James, for no specific reason except that both of them liked it and it sounded solid, the way a name should sound. James Collins Watkins was, by general consensus, the finest infant in Harrow Creek, though his parents tried to maintain the modest position that they were not entirely objective judges. He grew with the efficiency of the well-fed and well-loved, and by the following spring he was a substantial presence in the boarding house in a small cotton shirt, and the expression of a person who finds the world endlessly interesting. Margaret Poe, who had become his informal godmother without anyone formally declaring it, taught him things appropriate to his age with the professional enthusiasm of a woman who genuinely loved teaching and had been managing with older children for too long. Old Cyrus would have been delighted with him. Harold Voss, who had finally moved on from the boarding house when his road uncomplicated itself sometime in the summer of 1875, sent a small toy from wherever he had landed, which arrived with a note that said he thought of the boarding house with great fondness and hoped the Watkins family was well, and they were. The year 1876 brought a change that had been coming for some time, which was the formalization of the arrangement between Benjamin and Thomas Greer. Thomas Greer was in his early 70s now, and his health was in the general state of health that age brings to men who have worked hard physical lives in a hard physical land, which is to say he was still largely himself, but knew he would not be indefinitely. His sons remained in the East and showed no more interest in cattle than they ever had. Benjamin had been managing the operation with increasing independence, and the land and the herd had improved under his attention, and both men knew that the time had come to put what existed between them onto paper in a more permanent way. The agreement they reached over the course of 2 long evenings at Thomas Greer's kitchen table, with Stella present for both because Benjamin was constitutionally incapable of making a major decision without her perspective, and had the good sense to know it, was that Benjamin would purchase a half-interest in the ranch at a fair price, paid in installments over 5 years from the profits of the operation, and that upon Thomas Greer's death or retirement, the operation would transfer fully to the Watkins family. It was a fair agreement and a generous one, and Thomas Greer said so himself, and Benjamin said that the fairness went both ways, and they shook hands with the gravity of men who understand that a handshake is still the truest seal a man can put on a thing. They built a house on the edge of the Greer land in the spring of 1876, not a grand house but a proper one, 4 rooms and a real kitchen and a porch that ran the full length of the front, looking out over the land that was theirs. It was not very far from the boarding house, which was intentional, because neither of them wanted to be far from it. Stella had found someone to take over the management of the boarding house, a capable widow named Agnes Moore, who had come to Harrow Creek the previous winter and shown an immediate aptitude for the work. And Stella trained her through the spring with the thorough and patient instruction of a woman who had built something worth teaching properly. The morning they moved into the house was a Thursday in early May, with the wildflowers doing what Texas wildflowers do in May, which is to bloom with an extravagance that seems almost ostentatious given how spare the land is the rest of the year. Stella stood on the new porch with James on her hip, and she looked out at the land and the sky and the scrub brush and the red dust road and the boarding house just visible at the edge of town, and Benjamin stood beside her. "What are you thinking?" he said. She was quiet for a moment. "I am thinking about a 9-year-old girl," she said, "who watched her father ride away down a road that looked exactly like this one, and thought that this was the kind of country that took things from you." He waited. "And I am thinking she was wrong about that," she said. He put his arm around her, and James, who was 7 months old and had the decisive nature of a person who has already figured out what he wants, grabbed a fistful of Benjamin's shirt with the confidence of ownership and held on. They stood there in the May morning and looked at everything that was theirs. The years that followed were the years of a life being built, which is to say they contained all the things that lives contain when they are being built with intention and love. The difficulties and the recoveries from difficulty, the ordinary days that are the majority of any life and that look unremarkable from the outside, but are in fact where the real substance of things lives, and the extraordinary days that arrive at intervals just frequent enough to remind you that the ordinary ones are worth having. Benjamin grew the cattle operation with the steady thoughtfulness he brought to everything, learning from Thomas Greer everything the old man had to teach, and then pushing further with ideas of his own about how the land might be managed and the herd improved. He had a gift for it that he had not fully understood until he had something at stake, the way some capacities need the right investment before they declare themselves. He was respected by the hands who worked for him, because he was fair and demanding in the right proportions, and because he was the kind of man who did not ask anything of anyone he would not do himself, and in the culture of ranch country, that was the primary credential. Stella found a new version of herself in those years, freed from the daily management of the boarding house but not from the habits of industry it had built in her, and she put those habits toward the house and the kitchen garden and the children and the endless civic business that she could not seem to walk past without picking up. She became involved in the school, supporting Margaret Poe's ongoing efforts to build the curriculum and the resources available to the children of Harrow Creek, contributing time and organization, and the occasional firm word to the town council when they needed to be reminded that the school was not a luxury but a foundation. She read voraciously. The book Benjamin had given her followed by every other book she could get her hands on, ordered through Crawford's or borrowed from Margaret or occasionally obtained from the occasional traveler who passed through with a volume to trade. She was a woman whose mind had been waiting its whole life for room to move, and now that it had room, it moved with considerable energy. Margaret Poe did marry Robert Alcott in the spring of 1877, which Stella had predicted with the confidence of someone who had watched the whole thing develop from close range, and had given 1 or 2 key pieces of advice at the critical moments. The wedding was a cheerful occasion, and Stella stood up as her witness, and Benjamin and Robert Alcott found each other to be exactly the sort of men who get along easily, which is to say neither of them was performing anything, and they could talk about practical matters without it becoming complicated. Thomas Greer died in the winter of 1878, which was not unexpected but was nonetheless a grief, because he had been a good man of the sort that Harrow Creek could not easily replace. He died as he had lived, without much fuss, in his own house, and he left a will that confirmed everything he and Benjamin had agreed, and he left his personal effects to Benjamin directly, which included a pocket watch that had been his father's and that Benjamin carried from that day forward. They buried him beside his wife in the cemetery, and Benjamin stood at the graveside and felt the weight of what had been given to him, not just in land and cattle but in trust, and he resolved as he stood there in the winter cold to be worthy of it. The operation was fully theirs now, and Benjamin threw himself into it with the energy of a man who has finally found the territory that was always meant to have his name on it. He hired on 2 more hands in the spring, young men from the area, and he ran the operation with a generosity toward the people who worked for him that was remarked upon, because generosity in employers was not so common in 1878 that you could afford not to notice it. Stella had their second child in the summer of 1879, a girl this time, who came into the world with opinions that she expressed clearly and at volume, and they named her Clara for Stella's mother, and James, who was nearly 4 by then and had Benjamin's gray-blue eyes and Stella's auburn hair in a combination that would make him extremely troublesome in about 15 years, was presented to his sister with the solemn ceremony of a small boy who understands that something significant has happened, but is not entirely sure how he feels about it. He decided he felt good about it by the following Tuesday, when he discovered that having a baby sister meant that adults directed their attention toward her frequently enough that he could pursue his own investigations around the property with reduced supervision. And he took full advantage of this, which gave his parents their first experience of the particular parental terror that comes from a small child who has found something interesting and not mentioned it to anyone. Clara was a different kind of person from James from the beginning, quieter and more observational, with her mother's eyes and a quality of still attention that sometimes unnerved people who were not used to being studied carefully by very small children. She adored her father with a devotion that James found outrageous and that Benjamin found completely overwhelming, and she sat on the porch with him in the evenings while he worked or read, perfectly content to simply be in his vicinity, which he reciprocated completely. By 1880, Harrow Creek had grown. The railroad had come through the previous year, connecting the town to larger arteries of commerce and bringing new people and new businesses, and the attendant complications of both. It was a different town from the one Benjamin had ridden into in 1873, both larger and louder, and not entirely improved by the changes, because growth brings things that small communities are not always prepared for, men who move quickly and mean poorly, schemes that look like opportunity and turn out to be extraction, the pressures on land and water that come when more people want the same finite things. Benjamin navigated the new landscape with care, protective of the operation and the land in ways that made him sometimes unpopular with the faster-moving men, who saw the new railroad as permission to push harder and faster on everything. He had a run-in in the spring of 1880 with a land speculator named Caldwell who had ideas about a portion of the Greer land that were not compatible with Benjamin's intentions for it. And the run-in was conducted at the level of legal papers and town council meetings rather than anything more dramatic. But it was real and it was sharp. And Stella sat up with him through 2 nights of it, going over the documents with the same meticulous intelligence she had always brought to the ledger. And between her reading and his and the opinion of a lawyer they sent for from San Antonio, they established their claim to the disputed portion beyond any further question. Caldwell moved on to easier targets. Benjamin and Stella had a very good dinner to celebrate, just the 2 of them after the children were asleep, at the kitchen table by lamplight in the way that had been their tradition since the very beginning. "To holding our ground," she said, raising her coffee cup. "To the woman who helped me hold it," he said. "To us," she said. "To us," he agreed. They were 36 and 31 years old, and they had been married 6 years, and the way he looked at her across that kitchen table was not essentially different from the way he had looked at her across the boarding-house table 7 years before, watching her push the last biscuit toward someone else and feel the crack open in his chest that had never fully closed. Only now the look had 6 years of life in it, and 2 children, and a piece of land, and 1,000 evenings exactly like this one. And it was richer for all of it in the way that love is richer when it has been lived in rather than just felt. The decade of the 1880s brought Harrow Creek more firmly into the modern era, which was a complicated gift. The telegraph, which old Cyrus would have appreciated deeply, was fully operational in the town by 1882, connecting it to the wider world in ways that felt almost unnatural to people who had spent decades in relative isolation. The telephone came to San Antonio in those years, though it was some years yet before it reached places like Harrow Creek. The railroad brought newspapers from the eastern cities, and Stella read them with the voraciousness of a person who has been hungry for information about the larger world and is not going to waste a single article now that it is available. The injustices of the era were present and visible and not easily ignored, and Stella was not someone who looked away from things she could see. The treatment of the Mexican families who had been in the region far longer than most of the Anglo settlers, but who found themselves increasingly pushed to the margins as the town grew, was something she spoke about at town council meetings, with the same plainness and force she brought to everything, not without effect, and not without opposition. Benjamin backed her in this, not just because he agreed with her, which he did, but because he had come to understand that one of the ways you love someone like Stella Collins is by standing in the places where she is standing when she is right. The children grew. James, at 10, was a boy of irrepressible energy and startling curiosity, who had adopted the cattle operation as his primary area of interest, and followed his father around it with a devotion that Benjamin found both moving and practically useful. Because a 10-year-old who is genuinely interested in learning ranch work is worth more than his age suggests. Clara, at 7, had developed a passion for reading that her mother recognized immediately and fed without restraint, and the house was accumulating books at a rate that Benjamin observed with fond bemusement and occasional concern about the structural load on the shelves. They had a third child in 1883, another boy who came in the easy way that third children sometimes do, as though the process has finally figured itself out, and they named him Thomas, for Thomas Greer, who deserved to be remembered by more than a headstone. Thomas was a merry, round child with Benjamin's gray-blue eyes and a quality of uncomplicated happiness that his older siblings found both endearing and slightly exasperating in the way that relentlessly cheerful people can be. And he became the town's favorite child almost immediately, because some people are simply born with the gift of being generally beloved, and Thomas Watkins had it absolutely. Agnes Moore continued to run the boarding house with competence and genuine care, and Stella remained involved with it, stopping by several times a week, maintaining a connection to the place that had been her life and her mother's life, and that she was not prepared to sever entirely. She had made improvements over the years, new curtains and a proper pump in the kitchen and a repainted parlor, and the boarding house in 1883 was a considerably more comfortable establishment than the one she had inherited in 1871, which gave her a satisfaction that was part pride and part tenderness, because the boarding house was one of the ways she stayed in conversation with her mother. The cattle operation in those years was thriving in the way that honest hard work and good land management eventually allows things to thrive. Benjamin had expanded the herd carefully and had relationships with buyers in Kansas City and Abilene that he maintained with the same quality of steady reliability he brought to everything. He was not the richest man in Harrow Creek, but he was among the most trusted, and in the long run that is the more useful currency. He hired a hand in the spring of 1885, a young man of 20 years named Will Sayers, who had come from Louisiana with good skills and an obvious desire to prove himself. And Benjamin recognized in Will the quality he had seen in himself at 22, the particular combination of ability and direction-seeking that is both a strength and a vulnerability in a young man, and he made it his business to be the kind of employer who pointed that quality toward good things. He paid Will fairly and worked him honestly and told him the truth when the truth was useful, and Will Sayers became one of the best hands on the operation, which Benjamin considered one of the more satisfying accomplishments of his professional life. Stella turned 40 in the spring of 1890. Benjamin threw her a party that she would have objected to strenuously had she known about it in advance, which was why he had arranged it with Margaret Poe, and conducted the whole enterprise with an operational secrecy that would have been impressive in any theater of activity. He brought her home on her birthday evening to find the porch lit with lanterns, and the yard full of people who had been touched by Stella Collins Watkins in the 16 years since she had been an exhausted young woman running a boarding house on the edge of Main Street, the schoolchildren and their parents, the current boarders from the boarding house, neighbors from the ranches around theirs, people from the town council and the school board and the church, and all three of their children. James, now 15, and standing very straight in his good shirt with his father's jaw and his mother's steadiness. Clara at 11 looking at the gathering with those still observational eyes that missed nothing, and Thomas at 7 running in circles because there was a party and he was Thomas and that was what he did. Stella stood at the edge of the yard and looked at all of it, and Benjamin stood behind her with his hands on her shoulders, and she was quiet for a long moment. "I did not plan this," she said. "I know," he said. "I would have objected to this strenuously," she said. "I know that too," he said. "It is completely wonderful," she said. He kissed the top of her head, and she turned and looked at him with those warm brown eyes that were the same eyes she had always had, and that he had never once finished looking at. "40 years old," she said. "You are magnificent at 40 years old," he said. "You are a biased source," she said. "Utterly and without apology," he said. The party was everything a party at the edge of the Texas frontier in 1890 could be, which is to say it was warm and loud, and full of food that Stella would later want to know the exact provenance of every dish. And the music was the kind of music you could dance to under an open sky, fiddle and guitar from 2 of the ranch hands who had the gift for it. And they danced, Benjamin and Stella, in the lamplight yard with the first stars coming out. And it was not graceful dancing, because Benjamin had never been a graceful dancer, but it was entirely sincere, and she laughed the whole way through it, that full genuine laugh that he had first heard from her in their parlor on a January night 6 years before the rest of the world had known either of them was there. James left for college in the fall of 1893 to the State Agricultural School in College Station, which had opened 9 years prior, and which he had been working toward with focused intention since he was 14 years old. Watching him go was the particular kind of grief that is not quite grief because you are proud, and it is right, and you wanted this for him, and it is still a loss in the chest that takes its own time with you. Stella stood on the road and watched the stage that was taking him to the train, and then turned and walked back into the house with a composure that lasted exactly as long as it took her to sit down at the kitchen table, where Benjamin sat across from her, and did not say anything wise or helpful, because he knew her well enough to know that no wisdom or helpfulness was what was wanted, and he simply held her hands in his and let her be sad, and that was exactly the right thing. James was not lost to them. He wrote letters with his father's thoroughness and his mother's specificity, long detailed letters about his coursework and his professors and the other students, and the weather in College Station, and his thoughts on cattle breeding and land management, and they wrote back with equal detail, and the correspondence became its own form of presence, the family extending itself across the distance of a few hundred miles without breaking. Clara, at 17, had become the person it was already clear at 7 she was going to be, a young woman of formidable intelligence and absolute clarity about what she thought about any given subject, who had read more by 17 than most people manage in a lifetime, and who was beginning to articulate ideas about education and women's opportunities that were not universally popular in Harrow Creek in 1893, but were impossible to dismiss, because she made them with such precision. She wanted to teach, like Margaret Poe, but she wanted to teach more and further and differently than the available options in Harrow Creek permitted, and Stella watched her daughter with a recognition that was both personal and generous, because here was someone who needed more room than the available room, and Stella was determined that the room would be found. Benjamin and Stella had long conversations in those years about what it meant to give their children what they needed, which was sometimes different from what was comfortable or close. The conversations were the best kind they had always had, honest and unguarded, each of them saying the thing they actually thought and trusting the other to take it seriously. And out of those conversations came the decisions that were the right ones, even when the right ones were the harder ones. Thomas at 10 was showing every sign of becoming a rancher in his bones, which made Benjamin quietly and profoundly happy, because there is a particular pleasure in watching your land and your work move into the hands of a child who genuinely loves it. Thomas followed his father everywhere with the same focused devotion that James had shown at 10, but with a different quality to it, more sensory, more intuitive, a boy who learned by feeling the land under his feet rather than by reading about it, which was a different gift from his brothers and no smaller. Margaret Poe Alcott retired from teaching in 1895, after 22 years in the Harrow Creek schoolroom, which was not a retirement she had planned but one that her health eventually required, and the town gave her a proper send-off that she deserved, and that she received with the dignity of a woman who has done good work and knows it without needing to be told. She and Robert had no children of their own, which had been a sorrow, but they had something in its place that was not nothing, the children of 22 years of teaching, hundreds of them who had gone through her classroom and come out knowing more and thinking better, and that was a legacy that counted. She and Stella remained as close as they had always been, and the hours they spent in each other's company in those years were full of the particular ease and richness of a long friendship between two people who have always been honest with each other, and have therefore never had to rebuild anything. Clara left Harrow Creek in the fall of 1896 to attend a teacher training school in Austin, which had begun accepting women, and her departure had a different quality from James's, because Clara was not going toward something predictable, but toward something that was still being defined by the women who were brave enough to go toward it, and the pride Stella felt watching her daughter go was so large it was almost painful. Benjamin put her on the stage with her trunk and her books and her absolute confidence, and he came back to the house and found Stella in the kitchen garden, and he stood beside her in the autumn afternoon and said nothing for a while because there was nothing to say that would be adequate, and that was all right. James came home from College Station in 1894 with a degree and good ideas, and a quiet young woman named Sarah from the hill country whom he had met in his second year, and who arrived in Harrow Creek with the careful courage of someone entering a territory that is not yet mapped for them. And Stella received her with the warmth of a woman who understood exactly what it felt like to come somewhere new and have to establish yourself from nothing. Sarah was practical and kind, and had opinions about animal husbandry that James respected and about cooking that delighted Stella, and by the end of her first visit, she was simply part of things. James and Sarah married in the spring of 1896 in the same Methodist church where Benjamin and Stella had married 22 years before, with the same quality of blue sky doing its statement-making overhead. And Benjamin gave his son a look across that church as he stood at the front waiting for Sarah that contained everything a father can say to a son on such a day. And James received it with the steady, clear eyes of a young man who knows what he has and is grateful for it. They took over the management of the main cattle operation in 1897, which was a transition Benjamin had been preparing for quietly for 2 years, stepping back with a grace that surprised people who did not know him well and would not have surprised anyone who did. He was 52 years old in 1897 and had no intention of stopping working, but the nature of the work changed, became more advisory, more focused on the land management questions and the long-term thinking that benefited from experience rather than the daily physical demands that benefited from youth, and it suited him. Thomas, who was 19 in 1897, was already working alongside James with the full commitment of a young man who has found his purpose early and is grateful for it. He had his father's quality of patient attention and his mother's stubbornness, and James and Thomas worked together with the easy complementarity of brothers who are different enough to cover each other's gaps and similar enough to trust each other's judgment. Clara came home from Austin in 1898 with her teaching certificate and something else, a certainty about herself and about the world that was new even in her, a clarity that had been sharpened by 2 years among women who were demanding more than what had always been available to them. She came back to Harrow Creek not because she had been sent back or could not find something else, but because she had chosen it deliberately, because Harrow Creek had a school that needed a good teacher, and her mother was there, and the land was hers as much as any of theirs. She taught in the Harrow Creek School with a force and a brilliance that startled even the people who had known her since she was a baby, and she taught with a particular attention to the children who were on the margins, the daughters of Mexican families who were too often treated as less important, the children of poor families who were sometimes kept home to work rather than sent to learn. And she went after both injustices with the directness of someone who had been thinking about injustice for a long time and had finally been given a platform to address it. Stella watched her daughter teach with a feeling she could not have found a single word for, because it contained too many things. Her pride in Clara and her recognition of Clara and the echo of the 9-year-old girl who had wanted to study and had set it aside, not with bitterness, but with the acceptance of someone who understands what is and is not available to them, and the realization that something of what she had wanted had moved forward through her daughter in a form she could not have imagined, and that was not nothing, that was in fact everything. The turn of the century came on a clear night with a full moon, and Benjamin and Stella sat on the porch of their house in the Texas dark and watched 1899 become 1900, which in a more glamorous location might have involved a great deal of ceremony, but in Harrow Creek simply involved the night being quiet, and the stars being present, and a cup of coffee going cold in each of their hands because they had gotten absorbed in looking at the sky. They were 55 and 50 now, and they had been married 26 years, and the porch had weathered and been repaired twice, and the kitchen garden was in its 27th year, and the ledger, not the boarding house ledger but the ranch ledger that Stella still kept with the same meticulous precision she had always brought to numbers, showed a life that had been built honestly and well. "What are you thinking?" he said, because it was his question, always his question, because he was always interested in the answer. "I am thinking," she said, "about a Tuesday in October of 1873. He looked at her. "When you watched me eat half a bowl of stew," she said. "I remember it clearly," he said. "I was so irritated when you confronted me about it," she said. "I thought you were presumptuous." "I was presumptuous," he said. "You were," she agreed, "completely, and I am grateful for every single day of it." He reached over and took her hand on the armrest between their chairs, and she turned her hand over and held his. The moon was large over the Texas scrub, and the cattle were quiet in their pastures, and in the house behind them 3 grandchildren were asleep, because James and Sarah had given them 3 in the last 4 years. A boy named Henry who was 3 and already the image of James, and twin girls named Ruth and Anna who were 14 months old and had opinions about sleeping schedules that their parents were still negotiating with them. Clara was inside reading by lamplight with the discipline of a person who guards her reading hours as the essential resource they are. Thomas was in the bunkhouse with the hands, as he always was at this hour, comfortable there in the way he had always been comfortable anywhere that smelled of horses and open land and honest work. Benjamin held Stella's hand in the first hour of the 20th century and felt the fullness of a life that had been built from the right materials, not grand materials, not easy materials, but the real ones, work and honesty and attention and love that had not flinched when things were hard, because That is the only kind of love that counts for anything in the long run. He thought about the man he had been in 1873, a cowboy with a modest wage and a corner room, and a way of paying attention to things that had not yet found what it was meant to be paying attention to. And he thought about the moment at the table when everything shifted, when something cracked open in his chest that had never fully closed. And he understood, as he sat there in the moonlight, that the cracking open had been the best thing that had ever happened to him. Because everything else had come through that opening. "I never let it happen again," he said. "You know that, don't you? I made you a promise in that kitchen in October of 1873 when I was too much of a coward to say the honest version of it, and I have kept it every day since." She turned to look at him, and her face in the moonlight was the face he had loved for 26 years, changed by time and unchanged in everything that mattered. "You never let me go without," she said. "Not for a single day." "Not for a single day," he agreed. "And not for a single day more." She squeezed his hand, and they sat together in the quiet Texas night, while the new century settled itself around them like a coat being put on for a long journey, and the stars were very bright, and the land was very still, and everything that they had made together was present in the air around them. The children and the grandchildren and the boarding house and the ranch and the books and the ledger and the kitchen garden and the years, all the years of daily, ordinary, extraordinary life. And Benjamin Watkins held Stella Collins Watkins's hand in the dark and felt something that had no name in any language he knew, and that he had spent 26 years trying to be worthy of, and knowing that he would spend all the years that remained in the same attempt, and that the attempt was the point, and that the love was the point, and that the woman beside him was the entire point of everything. The moon moved slowly across the Texas sky, and the porch was warm with the last of the year's stored heat, and the horses stirred once in the near pasture and were still, and the night was full and complete and entirely without lack. James would come home in the morning with Henry on his shoulders, and Sarah would help Clara with the twins, and Thomas would be at the barn at 5 with the efficiency of a young man who has inherited the best habits of the people who raised him. And the kitchen would fill with the smell of coffee, and the morning would begin again, as mornings do, with all the work and love that a day in a well-built life contains. But for now there was the porch and the moonlight and the hand that Benjamin Watkins had been holding for 26 years, and the quiet certainty that there was not a single thing in his life or the world that he would have changed, not one biscuit pushed across one table, not one Tuesday in October, not one crack in the chest that had opened him up wide enough to let the best of his life come in. He brought her hand to his lips, once in the old way he had, the way she had never gotten entirely accustomed to and still felt in the particular place in her chest where the warmest things lived. "What was that for?" she said softly. "For everything," he said. "For all of it." She settled back in her chair and looked up at the stars of the first night of the 20th century, and she was smiling. And the smile was the one he had first seen in the boarding house kitchen on a cold November evening when she had taken off her spectacles and looked at him across a lamplit table and told him that he hadn't frightened her. And it was exactly the same smile now as it had been then, only warmer, only fuller, only more entirely hers and more entirely his. And it would be for all the mornings left to come.